NMMZ Monument reached out to heritage professionals within Zimbabwe beyond to submit their final comments on the draft heritage legislation. And I think you all appreciate that legal frameworks are very crucial in the promotion and protection of heritage in all its forms. So for a long time as professionals, we've always been lamenting the fact that legal frameworks in most African countries are antiquated. In most cases, they're inadequate to meet the new challenges of emerging concepts that are around the issue of management. So you are aware that currently in Zimbabwe we are using the National Museums and Monuments Act, Chapter 2511, which was promulgated in 1972, which makes exactly 50 years ago. So I'm happy to say that the review of the current act has been ongoing for quite some time now, and the draft that we engage with today was last updated, I think, in 2016. So today we are gathered courtesy of the Zimbabwe Association for Professional Archaeologists and Related Disciplines. It's to take part in a consultative process of the drafting of this Heritage Act of Zimbabwe. So we really thank the National Museums and Monuments for at least coming back to the stakeholders, or say stockholders, to engage with the document one more time before it's submitted for further processes. So I'm happy to say that to interrogate and improve this draft today, we will start with members of the panel who include, initially we were supposed to have Dr. Mpira, who due to other commitments has seconded the director of the Central Region, Mr. Cleberton Kutu. We also have Dr. Pascal Tarubenga. We are expecting Dr. Ndukake Ndovu. We also have Professor Nyaradzi Manyanga. And to all these panelists, I would like to say thank you very much for accepting this invitation to unpack this draft legislation. I'll start off with the regional director of the Central Region, Mr. Kutu. He has 18 years of experience in heritage research and conservation. He has been heavily involved in the drafting process of the document that we are engaging with today. He holds the master's degree in heritage studies, and he has been involved in issues to do with archaeological and cultural heritage impact assessment. And currently he is the acting regional director of the Central Region of the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, and based at the Military Museum in Wales. So to Mr. Kutu, I'll pose some few questions that will help us reflect on this draft heritage legislation. So I asked him to say something around these areas. Why did you decide to review the current act? And also want you to take us through the drafting process and briefly talk about the new areas that are in the proposed act and some of the guiding principles that you were looking at as you were drafting the draft legislation. And lastly, we would want to know what will happen to the draft afterwards. So what are the processes that are going to take place to this particular draft? So I hand over to you, Regional Director. If you could take us through your presentation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas Tolana. And thank you, Dr. Kapuma, for facilitating. I would want to thank everyone on behalf of National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe to come and participate in this session, where as National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, we would want to continue consulting in the process of revamping the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe Act Chapter 25 of 11. So, as Dr. Thomas Stolana has indicated, the process is to meet most of these stages so that we come out with something that reflects the interest of the people of Zimbabwe as interested parties and as affected parties in the areas of archaeology and heritage management. All of these heritage and archaeology, we may safely call them heritage resources, so that we put them in the same, bracket for the purpose of our discussion or presentation. So you would realize that this is Act review, and this Act review is necessitated by the fact that there was need to change the Act. And sometime around 2013, the organization constituted a team which involved the faces you are seeing on the screen to act on the drafting of the Act. Strategically, this also helped in soliciting for information from regions in terms of seeking information from academias. That is, for example, here we had to work with Midland State University, but we also had to make consultation with the local communities through the chiefs. We had to conduct government departments who were also having their linkages to discuss and bring the various comments that were brought by the stakeholders in the process of reviewing the Act. So you can see that strategically there were also regional directors from various regions who were now coordinating the stakeholders meeting in various provinces of Zimbabwe as part of the process of the stakeholders engagement. I hope you can hear me clearly, all of you. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, that's fine. So I think I can go ahead. So our consultant expert was Professor Mungeri, or I can safely say he is still the consultant expert, having a various experience in legal frameworks, and by then he was being a permanent delegate to UNESCO. So we felt like he has also experience with National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, and interacted with the various, academic people across the world, and having been involved in World Heritage issues, which basically World Heritage issues cover most of the issues which affect our heritage. So you can see that the Act from as way back as 1972, it changed in twice in 1976, and it changed in 1984, maybe as a result of the fact that the constitution of Zimbabwe had changed after independence. Then it also changed in 1990 and 2001. So there were some minor changes which were being made during that time. And accordingly, when we felt that there was need to review the Act, many circumstances were considered. For example, the current Act was strongly criticized, as Dr. Tolana has indicated, from around 2000 to date. Yes, before that, the criticism was there, but from 2000 to date, the criticism was louder. I remember doing an assignment, critiquing the act sometime when I was at the university. Then there were also constitutional changes in 1980 and 2013, which again required us to align the act with the constitution of Zimbabwe. And that was one of the main reasons why we had, because you realize that the constitution brought about new issues, even to do with cultural heritage, to do with culture and community engagement in processes to do with the cultural heritage management. You would also realize that along the way, the mandates of NMMZ were broadened, and most of them were not covered in the current act. If you look at the issue of archaeological impact assessment, you would realize that EMA reviewed the Environmental Management Act in 2002, and basically it was the formation of a new organization after the disbandment of the natural resources. It was natural resources managed board, something like that, which was responsible for natural resources, which included Zinwa, EMA, when it was disbanded. So right now, we don't have much to say about the archaeological impact assessments, except the act says no person shall excavate or remove or take from a national monument or from a monument, or that any person who discovers a monument must report within 24 hours. So this is what we are using, but this is indirect in terms of application. So there were also systematic developments in the region and across the international community when most countries reviewed their acts. And the reasons why they reviewed is that there were also various changes in the way heritage and archaeology were managed, including promulgation of new conventions, charters, principles, and guidelines. Around the 1980s, some guidelines, principles, etc., were not in place when some restorations were done at the Great Zimbabwe and Naletale, and so you would realize that people had the freedom even to add cement to these monuments as part of maintenance or reconstruction. So all those issues have to be captured or were captured in the new act, having considered that they were missing. So what can we consider as a good act? What we had to look at then was to look at what could a good act look like for heritage management, for heritage conservation. What does the current act provide, or what does the current act like? These are also the other things that we considered. Then the provision of legislation suitable for Zimbabwe without reinventing the wheel. We are saying what is the best practice across the globe in terms of these issues, and what other section can we retain which are relevant, and can we borrow from other countries in sub-Saharan Africa? We realize that there was some kind of a stampede when Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and other countries in the region changed their act, and I think Zambia was way earlier. And we were left out, and we are still left out. So we felt like it was necessary to revisit the issue of the act. So one other thing is that when the act was done around the 1970s, there was no consultation maybe that was. So I was talking about consulting all stakeholders, both interested and affected. So in terms of the issues that we also considered, which we can say these are the gray areas that we still need assistance, or that way we have done something, include alignment, new act to other related existing laws. and the Constitution of Zimbabwe. So we are looking at some of the state laws, which include the EMA Act, the Land Acquisition Act, the Mines and Minerals Act. How can we make sure that our act is also in line or in tandem with this act, so that at the end of the day, we don't see various conflicts, but we see alignment. If you look at the EMA Act talks of man-made buildings or cultural or culture aspects being part of the environment. The environment includes land, it includes water, air, people, animals, and vegetation, the ecology part of it, biodiversity. But also the man-made things are also part of it. So in the process, we are aligning ourselves with the EMA Act so that we are able to say people can safely do archaeological impact assessments deriving from the EMA Act, but at the same time guided by the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe Act. The same applies with the Mines and Minerals Act. Mines and Minerals Act talks of reserved areas. So one cannot prospect in a peg a mine claim or a special grant in a protected area. So when we are then aligning our act to these, act, the Mines and Minerals Act, the EMA Act, and other acts and bylaws, customer law and traditional laws, and traditional processes, we are encompassing the protection, the safeguarding of heritage resources in Zimbabwe. So this is one thing that was lacking in terms of which is lacking in terms of the current act. Then we also looked at international law, what had changed. Section 34 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe speaks of domestication of international instruments to which Zimbabwe is a party to. Then we have got other conventions which came way later after this act. We are not saying if we are going to have another, convention that can come way after we have done this current act, we can also consider doing that in the statutory instrument way, which EMA is using in its processes, because you realize that the act should also give the provision of the development of statutory instruments, which will be also the same part of the same act. It's an expansion of sections of the act. So we have the Convention on Protection of Heritage in Times of War, a Convention on Illicit Trafficking, World Heritage Convention. The 2003 legislation convention is also on safeguarding intangible heritage. It's also the latest one. And you would realize that the current act, NMMZ Act, does not speak about intangible cultural heritage. Then the issue of ICOM Code of Professional Ethics. All museums in the world are governed by ICOM standards. These are the main issues that we brought up as the new areas that we felt must be critically covered, even though we did not cover. Looking at the issue of definitions, there were no definitions for maybe cultural and natural heritage, tangible and intangible, movable and movable, archaeological impact assessments, liberation heritage, and the definition of museum. The issue number 3 is the role of communities protecting and preserving national heritage, which has been, a call from UNESCO, ICOM, and IUCN. So the review accommodated participation of the local community. Then we have the issue of community, the issue of ownership. The issue of ownership is yes. It seems every heritage, all the heritage belongs to the government. So even National Museum does not own that heritage because it's holding it in trust of the people. So do we have a way of having provisions which also look at, providing ownership in context of maybe communities, in context of import and export of heritage and other areas? Then issue 5, we have the issue of burial grounds and graves. You would realize that as National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe have been engaged in various, projects to exhume and relocate graves. We have also been part of government's programs in exhumation in Zimbabwe and outside Zimbabwe, within massacre camps and mass grave sites. can we embrace this in the new act? Then we have got archaeological graves, we have got historical graves. How can we deal with them? Then, I talked about, victims of conflict, both in and outside the country. If you think of the Bondo scenario, those are some of the issues. Then we have inventories. Registered are not talked about or inventories. It's only national monuments and relics. What about others? What about museum collections? They are not protected, therefore. Then we have the issue of heritage and sustainable development, pre-development impact assessment, rigorous presentation and interpretation of heritage, being part of sustainable development. Then use of heritage for tourism, religious and cultural purposes. Then issue 10, safeguarding museums and heritage in times of peace and conflict. So these are some of the areas that we looked to say they are lacking, but I was not exhaustive, but I'm just giving a highlight to give us the direction as to from where the organization was coming from in preparing this draft. So you would realize that this draft was submitted to the ministry in 2016, and the ministry took it to its legal department. And when its legal department looked at it, they took it to the government legal department. But then it didn't go through other processes to become a bill where it will be now go through parliament and senate and eventually to the president for signing. So this is the process that we're expecting. But you would realize that there was change of events, change of government in 2017 when we now have the new the Second Republic. So because of that, there was also changes in terms of ministers. I can safely say, I think we have the fourth minister now. And the changes in ministers also seriously affected us because there was no action on most of these on most of these things. So we were affected. And one other thing that also affected the limitations were that when we were drafting the act, we suffered in terms of defining heritage in terms of cut-off dates. This is one other thing that we expect the contributors to help us. In the process of doing the act, we also suffered in terms of funding. I can simply say we're merely funding ourselves from our entrance fees, then our unavailability of the board. Since in 2013, we didn't have the board, we have been operating on our own. So at times, we are asked to refer issues to the board and the board is not there. So we're given another chance by the ministry. When they say now we want to take up this issue, before they take it up, can we look at it? Can you look at it again? And we have decided, can we bring it back to our stakeholders, to our partners as part of, a consultation or a consultative process so that we can come up with a proper act. I think basically this is what I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Kutu, for the presentation. Without wasting much time, let me move over to Dr. Tarwinga. Dr. Tarwinga holds a PhD in archaeology and specialized in world heritage issues and issues to do with stakeholder and sustainable development. He has over 25 years of experience in heritage management in various leadership and executive positions. Currently, he is with he's teaching and coordinating the heritage studies program at the World University in South Africa. He has extensively published, and one of the forthcoming book that he has authored is World Heritage and Sustainable Development in Africa, which we will expect sometime this year. So to Dr. Pascal Tarwinga, with all the years of experience that you have in the heritage industry, sector. Would want to know whether the draft legislation adequately covers areas to do with administration and management issues, and would also want to hear your take on the draft legislation. Would you want some more things added? Would you want to see some things removed from this draft legislation? So, over to you, Mkoma.
Everybody, and more importantly to Professor Munjeri, who has been my mentor, my father, and everything. Thank you so much for spearheading this process and also listening to us as we discuss the draft Heritage Act of Zimbabwe. I'll try to be very specific to certain clauses and give my input, but overall I think it's a good departure from the old act, and we must thank the team that has been working on this review, because it's taking us somewhere, and I think we need to just work together towards its finalization. So maybe the first one that I would want to put on the table is whether it makes any difference for us to just call it the Heritage Act of Zimbabwe, or we can just call it the National Heritage Act of Zimbabwe. It's a very minor thing, but I'm just putting it on the table. And then the second aspect is relating to the preamble, which I think it's great. It's founded in the Constitution of Zimbabwe. But I would like to think that there is logic in explaining what the act is going to be really, or the mandate of the institution, which is National Museum, in terms of its functionality. Because, for example, we talk about nature and culture, but from where I'm coming from, there's another entity that is responsible for nature. And we don't want to be seen as if we are taking the responsibility of another entity without explaining ourselves, how we find ourselves looking after part of the nature, which I think comes in the form of the specimens and the Natural History Museum. For example, we are not responsible for managing ecological systems and all these parks and everything else. So I think there is an opportunity for national museums to contextualize the dimension of nature. What actually does national museums look after, and how does that fit into the relevant authorities like your wildlife and management authorities? So, because remember that whatever you put in your act, you can be sued for neglecting it. So really we have to have everything that relates to us explained, apart from just linking the preamble to the Constitution of Zimbabwe. And then when it comes to the section on definitions, I think there are some definitions that are missing, and there is need to just go through the document consistently and pick up the terms that are missing. For example, we don't have a definition on armed conflict. We don't have a definition on management plan. We don't have a definition on townscapes. We don't have a definition on what we mean by parties. We don't even have definitions around disaster risk mitigation yet. I remember there was a very big discussion around disaster risk management in Zimbabwe. So we have to set a precedence in the legal process so that we create operational capacity for ourselves when we want to produce some of those supportive documents. And then, of course, we look at part 2, and there's mention of national heritage bodies. And in the content of the act, there's only one board, which is National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe. So I don't know how that can be treated, whether it's deliberate or there's need to look at it and contextualize it, and even mention the other heritage bodies that are being envisaged through this act, or it's just we refer to the National Heritage Board as simple as that. And then, of course, on section 4, of the Act, I'm looking at the sequence in which the functions of NMMZ have been put, and I would recommend that there's a rethink. For example, maybe we could start with C, D, and E can be joined by K, and A can be joined by N, and then followed by F, G, H, I, J. There's a logic to that you are emphasizing functionalities according to thematic approach, and all the way to the end. So it could be looked like that. And then also, I just want to raise the point under that section also that advice and providing professional expertise is cross-cutting on the functionality of this act, so it cannot be confined to one. And then also, the other issue, which I think comes under the functions of the body, if you look at E, there are a few selected heritage typologies, yet we are saying from the onset that we are going to be inclusive, including intangible and tangible, movable and immovable. So maybe we need to look at that list and make sure that it's inclusive, or we just take a standard approach where we say it's inclusive of all heritage typologies that are covered under this act, so that we don't have to mention some and not mention some. And then also on the same breath, there's I think it's H, which talks about the appointing, using the word fit for appointing the board and everybody else. I think we can improve that language by referring to good practices, to good HR practices, because fit might be not objective, but good practices in recruitment will give you an option of being objective and above other issues. And then also the clause 7, the constitution of the board. I think what we need to bring out there is the whole issue around good governance and practices, as well as ethics. I think it's a current thing, and it's something that we are all ascribing to. And also, I'm putting this for the next point for discussion. Is it possible for us to consider allowing public to nominate people to serve on the board, rather than just being silent? I can't remember the whole process now, whether it's the public that appoints and the minister considers, or it's just the institution that appoints and the minister considers. Because it's good practice to allow the public to influence that process and say, so and so must be in the board, and then they can be considered on merit and on meeting the criteria. And then clause 2 also on the same, under 7, I'm thinking that it should be inclusive of skills implied in the responsibilities and the functioning of the body. For example, we talk about sustainability, which are issues of marketing and tourism. We talk about conservation, and naturally we are expected from a governance perspective to have an audit committee or people with audit experience. And then of course in D, consider the issue of gender equity, which I think is supported by the Constitution, and it's a good practice everywhere. And then of course, when it comes to clause 8 on the chairperson, on the term of the chairperson of the board, it's not very clear, whereas for all the other board members it's mentioned it's 4 years. So I think we need to factor that into that clause 1 of 8, to say it's a 4-year term or a part of that 4-year term if they're appointed in the middle of a term of a council. And also clause 13, it says someone can be replaced on their death, but also there's a resignation. So we could say on the death and resignation. And then on clause 14, I'm not so sure, I'm just putting this on the table for discussion, because it has got serious financial implications on national museums. The number of meetings that are held per annum with the body. Because remember this, there's a board meeting which says it must be a minimum of 3. And then you also have your local committee meetings that are mentioned later, which equally must be a minimum of 3. So it means you have more meetings, within a year, and it's a financial implication. And is there a way of looking at this and fixing the maximum number of meetings for the board? Maybe, let's say, a quarter, which means it's a maximum of 4, so that the 5th one is actually really considered on the basis of the merit of the issue to be discussed and the financial capability of the institution. So here I'm trying to have the legal framework help national museums manage costs of running the body. Because sometimes you have people meeting 20 times, but nothing comes out of it, but you have incurred financial costs in traveling and allowances and so on and so on. So that's my comment on that one. And then, of course, also the issue around local committees. I think you really have to think about the frequency of such meetings in relation to the main body, and also the subcommittees of the council itself that could be factored. Of course, those are the things that can be put in the board policy rather than the act. And then on the appointment of other, which is clause 20, appointment of other staff, there's an impression at the moment that the board is responsible for appointing everybody. Whereas I think good practice says the board appoints the CEO, and then the CEO appoints everybody below them. But of course, the CEO can consult the board. So maybe there is need to clarify that, or if it's possible to consider that. I'm not so sure. I'm just putting it on the table. And then, of course, protection on part 2, protection of heritage. There's a term that we use, equipment, which I don't see in the definitions, because one would want to know what we mean by equipment and how does equipment, for example, relate to natural significance. So maybe let's explain that word equipment in the definitions, and also even define the term like townscapes, and define, for example, underwater heritage, because there's mention of heritage being extracted from water. And in our case, Zimbabwe, as a landlocked country, we are talking about lakes, rivers, and dams. So I think we need to contextualize that. And then on clause 22, we talk about national register and or inventory. I think we need to be consistent in the act, whether we are referring to both or we are referring to register and inventory, and whether it's an integrated register for sites and collections, which might be complicated. So we just need to really clarify what we mean by national register and inventory, so that we don't confuse people in the process. And then the issue around clause 25 on national monuments, I'm just putting this on the table on the basis that National Museums itself has set a precedence on how heritage sites can be classified in the country. And if you look at that, you look at the whole issue around liberation heritage, there's a national hero circle, there's a provincial hero circle, and there's a local district hero circle. And that has actually begun to speak to classification of heritage in the post-colonial period. And I'm actually triggering a debate on whether we should continue using the word monument in post-colonial, or we begin to speak about national heritage, provincial heritage, local heritage. Of course, you might think I've been influenced by South Africa, but yes, to a certain extent, but we have already done that in Zimbabwe with Heroes Acres. So is there merit in actually considering changing from the term monument to another term, just like, for example, national heritage, and so on and so on? And then on criteria, on clause 25, in particular 6, I'm recommending that maybe we should consider the delisting criteria to ensure this is not abused for monuments, for whatever national heritage that we want to delist. There should be a criteria, and I think we can sift through the act and come to a criteria which you can say a monument can be delisted for the following reasons, and so on and so on. And also number 7, on the same 25, number 7, I'm asking where does indigenous knowledge systems come in to assist, rather than just us mentioning the legal authority only. And 9, I think we should include, apart from management plans, we should include traditional management systems as an alternative management approach, because I think we are amenable to it. If I listen to NMMZ right from the beginning, you cannot talk about intangible heritage and not include traditional management system as a management approach in the Act. And then, of course, on clause 27 on protection, I think NMMZ has touched on this matter, especially on clause 5, which I think needs to be amplified, because the idea is to give legal prescriptions on how heritage impact assessments are essential, and how environmental impact assessments should incorporate heritage impact assessments. And because of the World Heritage Sites, and because of the Constitution that now allows us to domesticate the conventions, where applicable, we should actually make reference to the OUV-based impact assessment as part of our legal standing order. So there could be a link with, I think it's clause 44. And then on 28, which is acquisition of movable heritage, and please just let me know if I'm left with a few minutes. Acquisition of movable heritage, I think here we need to look at how to deal with, for example, heritage that will be disposed or acquired through auctions, commercial auctions. We have had the cases where, for example, in South Africa, where maybe Sarah wants to buy to acquire an object on auction, but this is an open bidding, and government procurement system does not allow you to go for open bidding. They require tenders. So you can't go through a tender process in a commercial auction. So maybe let's think outside the box and say, how are we going to factor that into our thinking? And then, of course, on clause number 29, 2C, the issue of compulsory purchases. How does this relate to rights issue and the rights of landowners in terms of use and access to their land? There's an article that just came out recently from the university. It's a book, actually, which is called Violence in Conservation, which is speaking to these issues where if they are not handled very well, you end up actually promoting serious issues around land conflicts and related processes. And for example, on 2910, we talk about compensation, but we are not specific as to what the compensation covers in terms of heritage management in Zimbabwe. What is it that we are going to cover in terms of compensation if we're going to compensate someone under compulsory acquisition of a private land? And then related to that, something which is not addressed is the issue of how to deal with heritage in private hands. For example, the outstanding soapstone bed in the custody of the Rhodes Trust in Cape Town. It might not be the only example, but I'm just using it to reinforce the point that we need actually to factor something about heritage in private hands in the Act. And then on clause 30 is the issue of research, excavation, permits and everything else. And I think the research must be added there. Yes, excavation is a specific, but there could be research without excavating, which we still need consent of the board. And also we should think of introducing the ethical clearance. I don't know whether we can do that with the National Research Council or it's national museums that can do. There have to be linkages where some serious ethical clearance is done for any research in Zimbabwe. And then, of course, the clause number 32, which looks at historic buildings and listed buildings, I think we need to have a conversation on the timeline and whether that is inclusive or not inclusive, the 75 years. And also, if we can, in clause 4 of 32, in point 4 of 32, if we can link that act to the relevant municipal act in terms of their provisions in order to effect protection and support for the management of these historic buildings. And then, of course, on clause 36, we talk about certain graves. I think that's point number 1. And I'm asking myself, is there no defined criterion linked to the Heroes Act process, Heroes Act, or the way of grading graves in terms of the Heroes Act processes and other influencing factors? So what I'm saying, if we can have a criterion for those graves. And then, of course, number 37, it talks about the human remains. Again, I think we should emphasize provision for ethical clearance for such research and access to human remains, given the sensitivity and the link with intangible processes. And then, of course, clause number 39, I'm recommending that let's include disaster risk mitigation, either as integrated into the text or as a component separate and close to talk about disaster risk, which is a real issue at the moment. And then the issue about heritage impact assessments, which I think is clause 44. I think we need to look at this issue about who actually accredits the professionals. In other countries, it's the professional associations that do that. And national museums can then recommend developers to those professional associations to find people who can do the impact assessment. Because here we're trying to avoid this thing about being a referee, a linesman, spectator, and the match commissioner. So maybe we need to really look at that and see how we can improve the transparency and governance around the appointment of accredited professionals to do the impact assessments. And then clause 9 on the same, which is 44, it would appear that NMMZ is unable to prosecute violators outside EMA processes. Could there be a possibility of looking at this and maybe have only legal provisions so that we could take action against any violators in terms of the HI processes? Of course, the issue of the OUV-based impact assessment comes again in this section because it's not mentioned and it's applicable to all the heritage sites that we have in Zimbabwe. And then clause 45, which talks about import, acquisition, and all these things. I'm thinking that those sections, import, acquisition, and export, could be under one section so that there's linkage in terms of what is being said for import, for acquisitions, and export. And it might help to reduce the process, the duplications in terms of the process flow. So it's something that I'm just putting on the table. And then the second last one is on clause 49, which includes community participation. And I think there has been debates around terminology that we can use. And at the moment, what is relevant or what is being accepted everywhere is that we are talking about community engagement and involvement as opposed to participation. So I'm just putting it on the table to say, do we keep that word participation, or we become relevant to the current framework of discussing community engagement and involvement in heritage management? And also the definition of parties, right? And which needs to come out in the definitions. And also, I'm not so sure whether we can talk about this matter here. I just read, I think it was yesterday in the newspaper, where National Museums has appointed a local community committee at Kami World Heritage Sites. Is it something that we wanted to offer into the legislation to say, where possible and practically, and National Museums will support the appointment of local communities at World Heritage Sites, but also have to speak to issues of resourcing so that we don't trap ourselves in funding some of these things when they are not providing benefit to the site. And then clause 32 also, I would really like the Act to be specific to the relevant act used by ZRP to process criminals and warrants of and issuing warrants of arrest and everything else. I think it's too generic. Let's be specific so that if somebody's reading it, they can cross-reference with the relevant act. And the last one is on clause 57, which talks about savings. And when you read the content of that paragraph, I could not relate the subtitle to the content that is being explained there. I'm not so sure whether I wanted to talk about savings as in terms of financial resources for NMMZ or something like that. I think there's need to relook at those two things, the title and the content that is below that subtitle. Given my time limit, I would like to submit those few considerations for your consideration. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ruing. I was generous with you in terms of time because we were talking about very important things. So thank you very much for highlighting the gray areas within the draft legislation that we get with today. Without wasting our time, let me now hand over to Professor Manyanga, who is a professor of archaeology and heritage management and currently the dean of the Simon Mzenda School of Arts, Culture and Heritage Studies at Zimbabwe University. So apart from administration, university administration, Professor Manyanga has been heavily involved in research and heritage consultancy under the UNESCO World Heritage Center across the African continent and beyond. Most relevant to today's discussion, he was contracted by ICRON to compile data on heritage legislation in various English-speaking countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which was part and parcel of the contributions that made it into the book that was edited by Dr. Nora, Professor P.T., entitled Legal Frameworks for the Protection of Immovable Cultural Heritage in Africa. So to Professor Manyanga, I would want to know if the current draft legislation is aligned to the Constitution of Zimbabwe and what is expected of a good and workable heritage legislation, and which areas must it cover after you have gone through it? What is your take? So I'll give Prof. Manyanga, who is my boss, exactly 10 minutes to ventilate these guiding questions. Over to you, Prof. Manyanga.
Thank you, Thomas. Greetings, colleagues. I notice that there are so many special people on this platform. My mentors, my brothers, my sisters, and lots of colleagues. It is indeed an honor for me to be on this platform and to express my views on the draft that has been produced on the new Heritage Act. And before I get to respond to your questions, I need to acknowledge the efforts of all the people we have come up with this draft, because at least we have something to critique and we have something to review. A lot of work indeed has gone into this. Coming back to your questions, Thomas, is the draft legislation aligned to the Constitution of Zimbabwe? It should be, because the Constitution is the supreme law of the country, and any law, practice, custom, or conduct that is inconsistent with it is deemed invalid. And one of the motivation to come up with this draft legislation was the need to come up with a law which is aligned to the 2013 Constitution. looking at the Constitution, I did realize that the expected alignment should have taken into consideration the founding provisions of our Constitution, such as the values and the principles, the national objectives, especially on aspects of culture and heritage, then the fundamental human rights and freedoms that pertains to issues of language, culture, and environmental rights. And finally, the issue of governance, especially one is to look at the different tiers of government, issues of devolution from national, provincial, and metropolitan and local authorities. And coming back to the question, if the draft is aligned, yes, some aspects are, whilst others are not.
Hello. No.
Sorry, there seems to be some background noise coming.
Can I proceed now?
Yes, Prof, thank you.
Okay, coming back to the question, if the draft is aligned, I was saying yes, some aspects are, whilst others are not. If one is to look at the different aspects, I will look, for example, at the founding principles and give credit where the draft is covering those aspects, and also note where I feel some of the founding principles are not being captured. Indeed, the draft respects the nation's diverse cultural, religious, and traditional values. If one is to look at the different categories of heritage that has been defined, and the sort of things that the Act seeks to cover. It does also respect and recognizes the liberation struggle by acknowledging that there is liberation heritage. It pays due regard to the diversity of languages, customary practices, and traditions. And also it recognizes the rights of ethnic, racial, cultural, linguistic, and religious groups. Although the drafts makes a reference, it makes reference to local committees of the board. If you look at section 19, it, however, does not have provision. It does not make provision for the full devolution and decentralization of power and functions following the national government's governing structure and its tiers. If you look at the draft itself, yes, it talks about, for example, the local committees, but one would have wanted to see the whole issue of the different tiers of government and issues of heritage being represented there, especially at the provincial and at the local level. And if also you are to look at some sections of the draft, they appear to impinge or to impose a restriction on fundamental human rights and freedom, especially if you look at the section on the issue of access to information, where under certain circumstances, the draft is suggesting that information will not be made available on issues of access. So I think there are issues that need to be worked on as the draft goes through the various drafting stages to make sure that it doesn't impinge on issues of rights and restrictions. Moving on to issues of the national objectives. Yes, it does cover a number of issues, especially if you look at the draft itself, which covers the promotion and preservation of cultural values and practices, especially section 16, part 1 of the Constitution, through the recognition of both tangible and intangible cultural heritage. The Act does that. However, these aspects, again, as I pointed out earlier on, they need to be devolved to the various tiers of government. such that the issue of the promotion and preservation of cultural values and practices are done at different levels. But the draft takes that into consideration. And also, it is clear also in the Draft Act that it endeavors to preserve and protect Zimbabwe's heritage. And this, again, is coming from the Constitution. However, my personal opinion is that I think aspects of good governance are questionable, especially if one looks at the proposed National Museums and Heritage Authority. Through the authority, the boards wield too much power on heritage matters, and this power may easily degenerate to abuse of office. Here, I'm looking at the various aspects to do with, for example, accrediting private museums, the practice of impact assessments. And if you look at the draft itself, indeed, it created a very powerful authority. It did create a very powerful authority. And I think there is need to moderate that, such that that would not bring to question issues or possible aspects of poor governance. The Constitution also makes reference to beneficiation of local communities from resources in their areas. And when it comes to heritage, this is a resource which is almost in every area. So while issues of community participation in the management, awareness, and education is covered in the Draft Act, the Act is silent on community beneficiation from heritage resources in their areas. I think this is an area which we can improve in the Act, such that heritage is looked at as a resource which should also benefit local communities, and in the same spirit that is also in the Constitution. The Constitution also emphasizes on the need for the respect for the dignity of traditional institutions. That is section, I think, 16, subsection 3. But however, this aspect is not well elaborated in the Draft Act. There is reference to indigenous knowledge systems. There is also a reference to traditional leaders. And this, again, I think needs to be elaborated further in the Draft Act, especially the contribution of traditional leaders. These have the role, they have the function that also deals with heritage, which is well elaborated in the 2013 Constitution. And I think the Traditional Leaders Act need to be referred to, especially on aspects of giving dignity to our traditional institutions, and also talking to other relevant legislations who have also a similar or a complementary function in the management of our heritage. Then on issues of human rights and freedoms, issues of freedom of conscience, which is in the Constitution, freedom to practice and propagate thoughts, opinion, and beliefs in public or private. The Draft Act proposes in other circumstances to prohibit entry by communities in areas designated as special protection. And I think, again, these are issues, again, of issues of freedom of conscience, how that can be done so that we can accommodate our communities. Then, of course, access to information, I've already pointed out on that. Then issues of language and cultural rights. I think the Act does, in many ways, tries to accommodate that by allowing communities to participate and access the different. There's talk of the issue of exercising cultural rights as authorized spiritual and other observances, which are permissible in the protected areas. I think these need to be clarified in the Act. What constitutes these authorized spiritual and other observances which are permissible in protected areas? Then there is the issue of environmental rights, which is a right, again, for every Zimbabwean, which is enshrined in the Constitution. And it is clear also in the draft that it tries to promote conservation and ecological sustainable development. But again, it's a matter of, again, overlapping, again, with other relevant heritage institutions in the country, like Parks and Wildlife Authority and urban councils, and many other legislation that I think the draft needs to be talking to. And so when one looks at the Constitution and what is in the draft, yes, there are a number of issues that have been covered, but also there are other issues that others may regard as excesses, which may need to be moderated. And going to your second part, Thomas, I'm sure I'm out of time, which is what is expected of a good and workable legislation. I guess I can make a quick run through that.
Yes, Prof, in 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes. Okay. In terms of what is expected of a good and workable heritage legislation, I think my colleagues have already pointed out on some of the key issues. The first thing is what I've been talking about. It must be aligned to the supreme law of the country. The law should reflect society's value system, which is rooted in its historical, social, political, and economic context. And then it should provide for the care of significance or care of sites and heritage places of significance and their preservation. It should provide for sustainable use of heritage, which it does. It should regulate professions and professionals, which it does, the draft. It should protect individual rights and liberties as enshrined in the supreme law of the country. It does, although with limitations of rights and freedoms under certain circumstances. It should bring order to the heritage sector. We think that will happen with the operationalization of this act, with the suggested improvements. To provide deterrence and punishment for those who break the law. It does. It should provide for institutions to allow for compliance and policing. Yes, it does, by suggesting the National Museums and Heritage Authority. It must provide against vandalism of heritage resources by the public. It does. The draft does. It must provide for the protection of heritage during implementation of development projects. Yes, this is the contentious issue on heritage impact assessments and archaeological impact assessments. The draft does that. It provides for the mitigation, rescue, and salvage of heritage. It does. It must provide for the conditions under which heritage may be altered, damaged, or removed. The draft does that. It provides for the movement of heritage objects, that is the import and exports. Yes, we may need to improve in the drafting, but it does. Issues of ownership and usage. Ownership, it does, but usage, I think there's need for elaboration in the draft on the context in which certain heritage can be used, especially by the public. Provides for the scope of documentation and declaring heritage items. The draft legislation does. The rights and obligations of owner, holder, and public agency, it does. And provide working definitions, it does, although these need to be expanded such that there is no ambiguity in some of the terms which are used in the draft. It must provide for ranking of heritage places and objects. it does, although it leaves it to the authority to determine the classification. I think it may be helpful for it to be elaborated here. And I can go on, I guess, maybe just the last one on my long list of what should have been involved and what is there and what is not there. One would have expected also to see in the draft and reference to technological advances, and especially the legislation should also have taken into consideration issues of digital heritage. And in the era that we are in, it is important that those aspects are also captured. And but generally, when one looks at the Act itself, the draft Act, it has some of the key aspects that are expected of a good and a workable legislation. What is important, I think, is to continue to work on the draft and to improve on the various sections that need elaboration. My final thoughts, colleagues, is that I think there is consensus that we need a new act, and an act which should strive to make us a middle-income country or better without damaging our heritage. But my concern is in the act is the concept of trusteeship, which needs to be handled with caution, and it takes from the previous act, and it is through that trusteeship concept that resulted in the expropriation of a people's heritage by the state and its agencies. Heritage belongs to people and it lives with the people. The new act must allow for sustainable use of resources and for heritage to contribute meaningfully to the desired state. And with that, I hand back to you, Thomas. I guess some issues we can pick them as we go through the discussions.